The message arrived at Jupiter Station on a cold morning in March 2247. Commander Hyunwoo Park was drinking his third coffee of the day when the communications officer called him to the control room. The young officer's hands were shaking as she pointed at the screen. The transmission was breaking apart, filled with static and strange sounds. But the words that came through were clear enough to make everyone in the room go silent. It was a cry for help, transmitted across thousands of light years of empty space. Hyunwoo listened as the alien voice spoke in broken English, learned from the diplomatic databases humanity had shared with the Galactic Council. The speaker identified himself as Elder Taven of the Volari people. His world was dying. His people were being slaughtered. They had nowhere left to run. Dr. Yuna Kim arrived 20 minutes later. She was the station's lead expert on alien biology and had spent the last 5 years studying every species humanity had encountered since joining the galactic community. She had never heard of anything like what Elder Taven described. The Kresh swarm, a species that wasn't really a species at all, but a hive mind that consumed everything in its path. They didn't negotiate. They didn't communicate. They simply ate. Entire worlds had been stripped clean, left as dead rocks floating in space. And now they had come for the Volari. Yuna pulled up everything the database had on the Volari. They were one of the oldest species in the galaxy, known for their peaceful ways and their contributions to medicine and art. They had never built weapons of war because they had never needed them. For thousands of years they had lived in harmony with their neighbors, but the Kresh didn't care about harmony. They had attacked without warning 6 months ago. The Volari colonies had fallen one by one. Their defense fleet, small and outdated, had been torn apart. Now only their homeworld remained, and Elder Taven estimated they had 3 months before it too would fall. Hyunwoo called an emergency meeting with Ambassador Doyen Lee, Earth's representative to the Galactic Council. Doyen was an older man with gray hair and tired eyes. He had been fighting political battles with the other council species for 3 decades, trying to earn humanity's place among the stars. The news he brought was not good. The Galactic Council had already received Elder Taven's plea. Every major species had been asked to help, and every single one had said no. The reasoning was always the same. The Volari territory was too far away. The Kresh were too dangerous. The risk was too great. Some species were more honest and simply said they didn't want to waste resources on a dying civilization. Better to let the Volari fall and hope the Kresh moved on to another part of the galaxy. Yuna felt sick listening to Doyen's report. These were the so-called enlightened species of the galaxy, the ones who looked down on humanity as primitive and violent. And yet when someone needed help, they all turned away. Hyunwoo asked the question that everyone was thinking. Could humanity help? Did they have the resources, the ships, the people to make a difference? The answer was complicated. Humanity had grown stronger in the 30 years since achieving faster-than-light travel. They had built warships and established colonies across several star systems. But compared to the older galactic powers, they were still weak. Their technology was inferior. Their fleet was small. And yet Hyunwoo found himself thinking about what it would mean to say no. To join the other species in turning their backs on people who desperately needed help. Was that who humanity wanted to be? He sent a message to Earth marked urgent. Within hours, the debate had reached the highest levels of government. The World Council convened an emergency session. News of the Volari's plea spread across Earth's networks. People argued in the streets, in homes, in offices around the globe. Some said humanity needed to focus on its own survival. They were still newcomers to a dangerous galaxy. Getting involved in a war against an enemy like the Kresh could bring destruction to Earth itself. Others argued that humanity had always been at its best when helping those in need, that their greatest strength wasn't their weapons or their ships, but their willingness to stand up for what was right. Captain Minho Choi watched the debate from his ship, the UHSF Indomitable, humanity's most advanced warship. He had been preparing for a routine patrol of the outer colonies when the news broke. Now his crew waited for orders, wondering if they would be sent to war. Minho was a career military officer, trained for combat since he was 18 years old. He had fought pirates and defended colonies from raiders, but this would be different. This would be a real war against an enemy that had destroyed civilizations far older and more powerful than humanity. Part of him was afraid. Any sane person would be. But another part of him, The part that had made him join the military in the first place knew what he wanted to do. He wanted to help. He wanted to fight. Because if humanity didn't stand for those who couldn't stand for themselves, what did that say about who they were? The vote on Earth took 3 days. It was close, closer than anyone expected. But in the end, the decision was made. Humanity would help the Valari. They would send everything they could spare. When the news reached Jupiter Station, Yuna cried. Hyunwoo allowed himself a small smile. Doyen simply nodded as if he had known all along what humanity would choose. The message was sent back to Elder Taven. Help was coming. It might not be enough. It might arrive too late. But humanity was coming and they were bringing everything they had. Elder Taven's response came back hours later. Through the static and the distance, his voice was filled with emotion. He thanked humanity. He thanked them for giving his people hope when no one else would. He thanked them for proving that there was still compassion in the galaxy. Hyunwoo stood in the control room looking out at the stars. Somewhere out there people were dying. People who had done nothing wrong except exist in a universe that sometimes spawned horrors like the Kresh. And humanity, young and weak and foolish by galactic standards, was going to try to save them. It was insane. It was dangerous. It could end in disaster, but it was also, Hyunwoo thought, the most human thing they had ever done. They were going to give everything to save people they had never met. And whatever happened next, at least they would know they had tried. 4 weeks after the human fleet arrived, the Kresh came. They appeared at the edge of the system like a plague. Their ships moving in perfect coordination. Captain Minho watched them on his screens and felt his blood run cold. There were hundreds of them, and these were just the scouts. The Kresh ships were not like anything humanity had built. They were organic, living things that pulsed and writhed in the darkness of space. Some were massive, as large as small moons. Others were smaller, faster, moving through space like sharks through water. They didn't reflect light normally. Instead, they seemed to absorb it, making them difficult to track. Admiral Siora's hands trembled as she stood beside Minho on the bridge of the Indomitable. She had fought the Kresh before and lost. Her fleet had been torn apart. Her people slaughtered. The colors of her skin showed deep purples and blacks, fear and grief mixing together. Minho placed a hand on her shoulder. They had spent the last month preparing for this moment. The asteroid belt surrounding the Valar system had been seeded with mines. Defense platforms had been positioned at strategic points. Every ship had been armed with the best weapons humanity and the Valari could provide. They were as ready as they would ever be. The combined fleet moved to meet the Kresh at the asteroid belt. It was the first line of defense, the place where they would make their stand. Minho commanded the human ships while Siora commanded the Valari forces. They had practiced coordination until it was second nature, their 2 fleets moving as one. The Kresh vanguard reached the belt and pushed through without slowing. The first mines detonated, massive nuclear explosions that lit up the darkness. Several Kresh ships were destroyed, torn apart by the blasts. But the others kept coming, flowing around the explosions like water around stones. Minho gave the order to open fire. Railguns launched solid projectiles at incredible speeds, punching through Kresh hulls. Missile batteries released their payloads, hundreds of warheads streaking toward the enemy. Energy weapons carved lines of light through space, cutting into the organic ships. The Kresh struck back. Their weapons were biological, launching masses of corrosive material that ate through ship hulls like acid. Some fired living projectiles that burrowed into ships and began consuming them from the inside. Others released clouds of spores that interfered with sensors and life support systems. The battle quickly became chaos. Ships weaved through the asteroid field using the massive rocks as cover. The Kresh were everywhere, their numbers seeming endless. For every ship humanity destroyed, 2 more took its place. Dr. Yuna worked in the medical bay of the Indomitable, treating casualties as they came in. The injuries were unlike anything in her medical training. Kresh weapons caused damage that spread and grew worse over time. She had to amputate limbs before the corruption could spread. Had to watch soldiers die because she couldn't figure out how to stop the biological attack fast enough. Ilara worked beside her, her colors showing constant reds and oranges. The young Valari engineer had lost her fear and found only determination. She helped Yuna understand the Kresh weapons, how they worked, what they did to living tissue. Together, they began developing treatments. On the bridge, Minho realized they were losing. The Kresh adapted to every tactic, learning and evolving in real time. Weapons that worked in the first hour became useless in the second. The enemy was intelligent in a way that was terrifying, a hive mind that shared knowledge instantly across all its ships. But humans could adapt too. Minho called his tactical officers together and they brainstormed new approaches. They started using the asteroids themselves as weapons, using tractor beams to hurl massive rocks at Kresh ships. They coordinated their fire to concentrate on single targets, overwhelming them before they could adapt. They began using their smaller, faster ships in suicide runs, ramming Kresh vessels at high speed. The battle lasted 72 hours. 3 days of continuous fighting with no rest, no pause, no mercy. Crews fought until they collapsed from exhaustion, were dragged to medical, treated, and sent back to fight again. Ships that ran out of conventional ammunition resorted to ramming. Pilots who lost their ships transferred to others and kept fighting. And slowly, impossibly, the tide began to turn. Yuna made a breakthrough in the medical bay. She discovered that the Kresh biological weapons were vulnerable to certain frequencies of electromagnetic radiation. She rushed her findings to Minho, who immediately ordered all ships to retrofit their systems. Within hours, human ships began broadcasting the frequencies. The effect was dramatic. Kresh weapons began failing. Their living projectiles died before reaching their targets. The spores that clouded sensors burned away. For the first time, the Kresh stopped adapting. They couldn't evolve a defense against something so fundamental. Minho pressed the advantage. The combined fleet pushed forward, driving into the heart of the Kresh formation. Admiral Siora fought beside him, her colors now showing bright reds and golds. Her people were fighting back. They were winning. The final Kresh ship was destroyed 30 hours after Yuna's discovery. As it broke apart, the pieces tumbling through space, a cheer went up across the human and Valari fleets. They had done it. They had defeated the Vanguard, but the cost had been terrible. 3 human warships were lost, over 800 personnel dead. The Valari had lost half their remaining fleet. Velar Prime's orbital defenses were heavily damaged, and Minho himself had been injured when a Kresh weapon breached the Indomitable's hull, the corrosive material burning through his left arm before medical teams could treat it. He refused to leave the bridge even as doctors worked on him. Commander Hyunwoo's face appeared on the communications screen from Jupiter Station, pale and worried. He had watched the entire battle through sensor feeds, helpless to do anything but wait. Minho gave him the report. They had won, but barely, and the intelligence data recovered from destroyed Kresh ships confirmed their worst fears. The main fleet was coming. It would arrive in 2 weeks, and it was 10 times the size of the Vanguard they had just barely defeated. Hyunwoo was silent for a long moment. Then he told Minho that reinforcements were on their way. Earth was sending everything it could spare, but even at maximum speed, help wouldn't arrive for 3 weeks. The human and Valari forces would have to face the main Kresh fleet alone. After the battle, the Valari held a memorial ceremony for the fallen. It was held on Velar Prime's surface in a vast amphitheater that could hold hundreds of thousands. Yuna attended with Ilara, standing among the crowd as Elder Taven spoke. The old Valari leader honored the dead, speaking their names one by one. Human names and Valari names mixed together without distinction. He called them all heroes. He called them all family. He said that humanity had proven something the rest of the galaxy had forgotten. That compassion was not weakness. That mercy was not foolishness. That standing up for those who could not stand for themselves was the highest form of courage. Yuna cried during the ceremony. So did Ilara. So did thousands of others, human and Valari alike. They had fought together, bled together, died together. They were no longer 2 separate species. They were one people, united in purpose and sacrifice. After the ceremony, Minho stood with Admiral Siora, looking up at the stars. Somewhere out there, the main Kresh fleet was coming to finish what they had started, coming to consume everything. Siora asked if humanity would leave, if they would take their ships and run while there was still time. No one would blame them. They had already done more than anyone had a right to ask. Minho looked at her and smiled. He told her that humans were stubborn. Once they committed to something, they saw it through to the end. No matter the cost, no matter the odds, they would stay, they would fight, and they would win or die trying. Siora's colors shifted to golds and bright blues, hope and gratitude. She thanked him, thanked all of humanity, and together they turned back to the task of preparing for the storm that was coming. The mobilization happened faster than anyone thought possible. Within 2 weeks of Earth's decision, ships began gathering at Jupiter Station. They came from every corner of human space, answering the call to help a species most humans had never even heard of until recently. Captain Minho stood on the bridge of the Indomitable and watched the fleet assemble. 12 warships, including his own. Some were old, patched together from salvaged parts and held together by the skill of their engineers. Others were new, fresh from Earth's shipyards, their hulls still gleaming. All of them were ready to fight. Behind the warships came the transports, 40 massive vessels filled with everything the Valari might need: medical supplies, food, weapons, ammunition, prefabricated defense platforms, and more. Humanity was bringing not just soldiers but the tools to rebuild and defend. Commander Hyunwoo coordinated the logistics from the station. 5,000 military personnel would make the journey. Soldiers, pilots, engineers, tactical specialists. But what surprised everyone was the number of civilian volunteers. 2,000 men and women had stepped forward offering their skills. Doctors, nurses, teachers, construction workers, technicians. People who had no military training but wanted to help anyway. Dr. Yuna Kim was among them. She had requested assignment to the fleet as chief medical officer and liaison to the Valari. Hyunwoo had tried to talk her out of it, reminding her that she was too valuable to risk. But Yuna had been firm. If humanity was sending its best to help, she needed to be there. The journey would take 3 weeks through multiple faster-than-light jumps. Minho used the time to drill his crews, running combat simulations and preparing for every scenario they could imagine. But he knew that nothing could truly prepare them for the crash. The few records available showed an enemy unlike anything humanity had ever faced. Dr. Yuna spent her time studying everything the Valari had sent them. Medical records, cultural information, star charts of their territory. She wanted to understand these people they were risking everything to save. What she learned made her more determined than ever. The Valari were pacifists by nature. They had developed advanced medicine and had solved diseases that still plagued humanity. Their art was considered the finest in the galaxy, their philosophy taught in universities across dozens of worlds. They were people who had chosen to build rather than destroy, to heal rather than harm, and now they were being wiped out by a species that was pure destruction, pure hunger, pure nightmare. The first jump went smoothly. The fleet emerged in an empty system, refueled from their reserves and prepared for the next leg of the journey. But the second jump brought them to a Valari colony world, and what they found there silenced everyone. The planet was dead. The sensors showed no life signs, no power sources, no movement. The cities were empty shells. The forests were gone. Even the oceans had been drained. The crash had taken everything, consumed it all, and moved on. Minho ordered a landing party to investigate. What they found would haunt them. The colony had held 2 million Valari. There was no sign of them. No bodies. No remains. Just empty buildings and a world stripped bare. One of the soldiers found a school. Inside were children's drawings on the walls, toys scattered on the floor, tiny chairs arranged in a circle. Yuna had to leave the building. She went outside and was sick in what used to be a garden. This was what they were fighting. This was what would happen to Valar Prime if they failed. She thought of Elder Taven's voice in that first message, the desperation and fear. She understood it now in a way she hadn't before. The fleet pressed on. At the 4th jump, they encountered survivors. A damaged Valari transport limping between systems, its engines barely functioning. Minho brought them aboard the Indomitable. There were 37 refugees, mostly children and elderly. They had fled their colony world just hours before the crash arrived. They had watched from space as their home was consumed. Many of them hadn't spoken since. Yuna worked with her medical team to care for them. The Valari were tall and slender, their skin shifting colors with their emotions. Right now, most of them showed dark blues and purples, colors that their database said indicated grief and despair. But one young Valari, a female named Ilara, showed different colors, reds and oranges, colors of determination and anger. She was an engineer, she told Yuna through a translator. She had lost her entire family to the crash, She wanted to help humanity fight back. Yuna brought Ilara's request to Minho. The captain thought about it for a long moment, then agreed. If the Valari wanted to fight for their own survival, humanity wouldn't stop them. Ilara was assigned to the engineering team. 3 weeks after leaving Jupiter Station, the human fleet finally arrived in the Valar system. What they found was both inspiring and heartbreaking. The Valari defense fleet, what remained of it, was still fighting. 30 damaged ships formed a defensive line around their homeworld, facing down the approaching darkness. Admiral Sayora commanded the Valari forces from her flagship. When Minho opened communications, he saw a being who looked exhausted beyond measure. Her skin showed pale grays and whites, colors of stress and fatigue. But when she saw the human ships, her colors shifted to brighter shades. Minho explained that humanity had come to help, that they brought ships, supplies, and people ready to fight. Sayora's response was silence for several seconds. Then she asked a simple question. Why? Why would humanity risk so much for strangers? Minho thought about all the reasons, the political advantages, the potential alliances, the moral imperative, but in the end he gave her the simplest answer. Because you asked for help and no one else came. Because it was the right thing to do. Sayora's colors shifted again, showing golds and bright blues. Hope and gratitude. She welcomed the human fleet and invited Minho to meet in person to plan their defense. The work began immediately. Human engineers swarmed over the damaged Valari ships, repairing what they could and upgrading what they couldn't. Defense platforms were deployed in orbit around Valar Prime. Weapons batteries were installed. Supply lines were established. On the planet's surface, medical teams set up hospitals and treated the wounded. Teachers began working with Valari children who had been traumatized by the war. Human soldiers trained alongside Valari defenders, sharing tactics and strategies. Yuna found herself working 18-hour days, coordinating medical care and learning everything she could about Valari biology. Ilara became her constant companion, helping translate and bridge the cultural gaps. Despite everything, or perhaps because of it, they became friends. Minho met with Admiral Sayora daily, planning their defense. The Kresh scouts had been spotted at the edge of the system. Intelligence suggested the vanguard would arrive in 4 weeks. The main fleet 2 weeks after that. They had so little time to prepare. But as Minho looked at the combined human and Valari forces working together, he felt something he hadn't expected: hope. They were outnumbered and outgunned. The enemy was stronger and more experienced. By every logical measure, they should lose. And yet watching humans and Valari work side by side, sharing knowledge and resources, he thought they might have a chance. Not because they were stronger or smarter than the Kresh, but because they had something the Kresh would never understand. They had each other. They had chosen to stand together, and sometimes that made all the difference. 2 weeks to prepare for the end of everything. Captain Minho used every second. The damaged ships were repaired where possible, salvaged for parts where they were not. Every weapon system was checked and rechecked. Every soldier drilled until they moved on instinct alone. The moon orbiting Valar Prime became the center of the most desperate plan in human history. The moon was called Valar II by the locals. It was a dead rock, airless and cold, orbiting close to the planet. But deep in its core were deposits of unstable materials that human engineers had been studying. Commander Hyunwoo, working with scientists on Jupiter Station, had calculated that if they could trigger a chain reaction, the moon could become a weapon. A bomb large enough to destroy most of the Kresh fleet. The problem was getting close enough to set it off, and surviving the blast. Minho called a meeting of all senior officers, human and Valari. He laid out the plan on the holographic display in the Indomitable's war room. They would lure the Kresh fleet into a kill zone near Valar II. A strike team would land on the moon and plant fusion charges deep in the core. When the charges detonated, the entire moon would explode. The math was clear. Any ships within the blast radius would be destroyed. That included the ships carrying the strike team. It was a suicide mission. Admiral Sayora studied the plan in silence. Her colors shifted through a dozen shades, processing the implications. Finally, she asked the question everyone was thinking. Who would volunteer to die? Mino had expected this. He had an answer ready. He would lead the strike team himself. It was his plan, his responsibility. But before he could finish speaking, every human and Valari officer in the room stood up. They all volunteered. The argument that followed lasted hours. Everyone wanted to go. Everyone had reasons why they should be chosen. Young officers who had nothing to lose. Veterans who had already lived full lives. Engineers who understood the systems. Soldiers who were the best fighters. Sayora herself demanded to be included, saying she had lost too many to the creche and wanted to look death in the face one last time. In the end, Minho selected a team of 50 humans and 30 Valari. He included himself and, despite his protests, Sayora. They were the best of the best, skilled enough to pull off the impossible. Or to die trying. Dr. Yuna heard about the plan from Ilara. The young Valari engineer was crying, her colors showing dark blues and purples. Yuna felt her own heart break. She wanted to argue to find another way to stop this madness, but she knew there was no other way. This was their only chance. She found Minho alone in his quarters, staring at a photograph of his family on Earth. He looked up when she entered, and she saw the acceptance in his eyes. He knew he was going to die. He had made peace with it. Yuna asked him if he was afraid. Minho was quiet for a moment, then admitted he was terrified. But more than fear, he felt something else. Purpose. His entire life had led to this moment. He was going to save billions of lives. What was one life compared to that? Before leaving, Minho recorded a message for his family. He told them he loved them. Told them he was sorry he would never come home. But he wanted them to know that he died doing something that mattered. That humanity had come to Velar Prime as strangers. But they would die as brothers and sisters to people worth saving. If humanity was remembered for anything, it should be this. They gave everything when it mattered most. The Kresh fleet arrived like a nightmare made real. Thousands of organic ships, so many they blotted out the stars. They moved with purpose, with hunger, with the certainty of predators who had never known defeat. Sensors showed the Nexus, the central hive mind, deep in the formation, a massive ship that coordinated the entire swarm. The battle began immediately. The combined human and Valari fleet fought with everything they had, but they were overwhelmed within minutes. For every Kresh ship they destroyed, 10 more took its place. The enemy adapted to their tactics, learned from their weapons, evolved faster than they could respond. Minho led the strike team toward Velar 2 as the battle raged around them. 3 transport ships carrying 80 people, who knew they were flying to their deaths. Kresh interceptors swarmed them immediately. Seora's pilots were incredible, weaving through the enemy fire, but they took heavy damage. 1 transport was hit. Its hull breached. 15 people died in seconds, sucked out into space. The remaining 2 transports pushed forward, protected by a squadron of human fighters who threw themselves at the Kresh without regard for their own safety. They reached the moon's surface and landed hard. The team rushed out, carrying the fusion charges and drilling equipment. They had minutes, maybe less, before the Kresh followed them down. The moon's surface was chaos. Kresh landing organisms began touching down, disgorging warriors bred for close combat. The strike team fought them off while the engineers worked. Minho and Sayora led the defense, their forces forming a perimeter around the drilling sites. The fighting was brutal. Hand to hand, weapon to claw, human and Valari standing back to back against waves of Kresh. Admiral Sayora took a hit protecting Minho, a Kresh weapon tearing through her side. She fell, her colors fading to pale grays. Minho caught her as she collapsed. He screamed for a medic, but Sayora grabbed his arm. She told him to finish the mission. Her colors shifted to gold for just a moment. She smiled, her alien features somehow conveying peace. Then her eyes closed, the charges were placed. The team prepared to evacuate, but Minho's transport was destroyed by Kresh fire. They were stranded. He ordered the remaining transport to leave, to get as many people out as possible. 30 members of the strike team piled aboard, including most of the wounded. Minho and the remaining 50 stayed behind, forming a last line of defense around the detonation controls. They fought knowing there was no escape. They fought because every second they bought meant more lives saved. Then through the chaos, a ship appeared. It was Admiral Sayora's flagship, piloted by Ilara. The young Valari engineer had refused to stay behind. She had taken the Admiral's ship and come for them. Ilara's voice crackled over the radio. She told them to get aboard, told them she had sworn to herself that humanity would not die alone on this dead moon. They had saved her people. Now it was her turn to save them. The remaining strike team fought their way to the ship. Minho was last aboard, running across the moon's surface as Kresh warriors closed in from all sides. He made it to the ramp just as Ilara lifted off, alien claws scraping against the hull. Minho reached the controls and activated the fusion charges. The countdown started. 30 seconds. Ilara pushed the ship's engines past their limits, racing away from the moon. 20 seconds. The Kresh fleet began to realize something was wrong. They started moving away from Velar 2. 15 seconds. The ship cleared the inner blast radius with 5 seconds to spare. Ilara pulled up, putting the bulk of Velar Prime between them and the moon. Then the world turned white. The explosion was like nothing ever seen before. The moon didn't just explode. It became a miniature star, a fusion reaction that consumed everything nearby. The shockwave expanded at incredible speed, catching the Kresh fleet in its embrace. 80% of the Kresh ships were destroyed instantly, vaporized by the blast. The remainder were scattered, their formations broken. And most importantly, the nexus was severed. The central hive mind that coordinated the swarm was destroyed. The remaining Kresh ships without direction began attacking each other. They were still dangerous, still deadly, but they were no longer a coordinated force. They were just animals, confused and afraid. The human and Velari fleets, already positioned away from the blast, moved in to finish them off. It took hours, but one by one the surviving Kresh were hunted down and destroyed. By the time Velar Prime's sun rose on the next day, the Kresh were gone. Minho stood on the bridge of Ilara's ship, looking at Velar Prime below. The planet had survived, billions of lives saved, but the cost had been terrible. So many dead, so many sacrifices, Admiral Sayora among them. Ilara stood beside him, her colors showing golds and soft blues. She told him that Sayora would have been proud, that all the fallen would have been proud. They had done the impossible. They had won. Minho nodded slowly. They had won. But as he looked at the debris field that had once been the moon, he wondered if winning was supposed to feel this heavy. The morning after the battle, Velar Prime was silent. Not the silence of death, but of exhaustion, of a world that had looked into the abyss and survived. Captain Minho walked through the medical facilities in the capital city, visiting the wounded. Human and Velari patients lay side by side, cared for by doctors from both species. Dr. Yuna had not slept in 3 days. She moved from bed to bed, treating injuries, saving lives where she could, offering comfort where she could not. When she saw Minho, she hugged him fiercely. She had watched the moon explode from the planet's surface, had thought he was dead. Seeing him alive felt like a miracle. The final count came in slowly over the following days. 7 human warships lost, 3,000 human casualties. The Velari had lost even more. Tens of thousands dead, half their orbital infrastructure destroyed, entire cities damaged by debris from the exploded moon. But they had survived. Against all odds, they had survived. Elder Taven addressed both species in the same amphitheater where they had held the first memorial. He looked older now, his skin showing the pale shades of grief, but there were also colors of hope mixed in, bright threads of gold and blue. He spoke of the fallen, naming them one by one. It took hours. When he finished, he talked about what humanity had done. They had come when no one else would. They had fought when the battle seemed hopeless. They had given everything, including their lives, to save a people they barely knew. The Velari, Elder Taven said, would never forget. For as long as their species existed, they would remember the day humanity proved that compassion was not weakness, that mercy was not foolishness, that there were still people in the galaxy who would stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. The ceremony ended with the unveiling of a monument. It stood at the highest point in the capital city, visible for miles, a massive structure showing human and Velari figures standing together, facing the stars. Carved into the base were the names of every person who had died defending Velar Prime. News of the battle spread across the galaxy faster than light. The Galactic Council, which had refused to help, now scrambled to respond. Some species sent belated congratulations. Others remained silent, embarrassed by their own cowardice, but there was also fear. Humanity's willingness to risk everything for strangers made them unpredictable. Their tactical brilliance had defeated an enemy that had destroyed civilizations for centuries. Some species began to see humans not as primitive newcomers but as a potential threat. Commander Hyunwoo faced inquiry on Jupiter Station. Earth's government questioned his decision to divert military resources to Velar Prime, leaving human colonies vulnerable. For 3 weeks, his career hung in the balance. Then public opinion made itself known. Across human space, people rallied in support of what had been done. They were proud of their military for standing up when others would not. They were proud of the sacrifices made. They wanted humanity to continue being a force for good in the galaxy, not just another selfish power looking out only for itself. The inquiry ended with Hyunwoo not only cleared of wrongdoing but promoted. Earth's government established what they called the Velar Doctrine. Humanity would always come to the aid of those who could not defend themselves regardless of cost. It was a statement to the galaxy. This was who humans were. This was who they chose to be. The Velari, for their part, offered everything they could to repay humanity's sacrifice. Their advanced medical technology was shared freely with Earth. Scientists from both species began collaborative research programs. Trade agreements were signed. Cultural exchanges were established. But more than any formal agreement, there was friendship. Humans who had fought on Velar Prime chose to stay, helping rebuild. Velari traveled to Earth, sharing their knowledge and art. Children from both species grew up learning about each other, studying each other's languages and customs. Dr. Yuna accepted a position as permanent ambassador to Velar Prime. She had fallen in love with the Velari people, with their culture, with their dedication to peace and beauty. Ilara became her assistant and closest friend. Together they worked to strengthen the bond between their species. Ilara had become something of a hero among her people. She was the one who had piloted Admiral Siora's ship to save the strike team. She was the one who had refused to let humanity die alone. Young Velari looked up to her, inspired by her courage. She used that influence to push for changes in Velari society. They had learned that pacifism, while noble, needed to be backed by the ability to defend themselves. Captain Minho returned to Earth to a hero's welcome. Parades were held in his honor. He was offered promotions, medals, speaking engagements. He turned down most of it. He had not fought for glory or recognition. He had fought because it was right. But he did accept one honor: a position training the next generation of officers at Earth's military academy. If he could teach even a fraction of what he had learned at Velar Prime, it would be worth it. He taught his students about tactics and strategy, yes, but more importantly, he taught them about why they fought, about standing up for those who could not stand for themselves, about measuring strength not in weapons but in the willingness to use those weapons to protect the innocent. Years passed. The galaxy slowly changed. Other species began to reconsider their positions. Some reached out to humanity, seeking alliances. Others remained distant, wary of this young species that had upset the old order. Then, a decade after the Battle of Velar Prime, another distress signal arrived. This time from a species called the Karathi, on the far side of the galaxy. They were being invaded by a different threat, their worlds burning, their people dying. They sent out a plea for help. The Galactic Council met to discuss the crisis. The debate went on for days. Most species argued against intervention. It was too far, too dangerous, too costly. The same arguments as before. Then the Velari representative stood up. Elder Tavin had passed away years earlier, but his successor carried on his legacy. She reminded the council of what had happened 10 years ago, how they had all refused to help, how one species had answered the call anyway. She played a recording. It was Captain Minho's final message to his family, the one he had recorded before the suicide mission. His voice was calm, certain, as he explained that humanity had come to Velar Prime as strangers but would die as family to people worth saving. The recording ended. The council chamber was silent. Then the Velari representative made a formal statement. The Velari would answer the Karathi's plea. They would send ships, supplies, and personnel. They had learned from humanity what it meant to stand up for others, and they would not stand alone. Other species began volunteering. Slowly at first, then faster. The tide had turned. Humanity had shown the galaxy a different way, and now that lesson was spreading. Earth's response was immediate and unanimous. Of course they would help the Karathi. It was not even a question. The Velar Doctrine was not just words. It was who they were. Minho watched the news from his office at the academy. He was older now, his hair showing gray, his wounded arm still causing him pain on cold days. But when he saw the ships assembling at Jupiter Station, saw humans and Valeri and a dozen other species preparing to answer another call for help, he smiled. That evening, he stood at the window of his apartment, looking up at the stars. Somewhere out there, people were suffering, people who needed help, and this time they would not cry out into an empty void. This time someone would answer. Commander Hyunwoo called him from Jupiter Station. The old friends talked for hours, reminiscing about Valor Prime, about all they had lost and all they had gained. Hyunwoo asked if Minho ever regretted it, if he ever wondered if the cost had been too high. Minho thought about Admiral Seora dying on that moon, about the 3,000 humans who never came home, about the sacrifices made and the pain endured. Then he thought about the billions of Valeri alive today because of those sacrifices, about the children growing up free, about the galaxy slowly learning that strength meant more than just weapons. He told Hyunwoo that he had no regrets, not one. They had proven something important that day, that compassion was not weakness, that mercy was not foolishness, that there were still people willing to stand up for what was right, even when it cost them everything. The galaxy, Minho said, had learned an important lesson at Valar Prime. When aliens pleaded for aid, humanity gave everything, not because it was easy, not because it was safe, but because it was right, and now finally they were not alone in that belief. The legacy of Valar Prime was spreading one species at a time, one act of courage inspiring another, one sacrifice leading to another. In the end, that was what mattered. Not the battles won or the ships destroyed, but the simple fact that when someone cried out for help, someone answered, and that made all the difference. Minho turned away from the window and went to bed. Tomorrow he would teach his students about Valar Prime, about courage and sacrifice and doing what was right. And somewhere in that classroom would be the next generation of heroes, learning what it meant to be human, learning what it meant to give everything when it mattered most. The stars above Earth shone bright and clear, full of promise and possibility. And in the darkness between them, other voices were calling out for help.